In 2014, Theranos told its investors it would earn roughly $100 million in revenue. Its actual revenue that year was about $100,000. That is not a rounding error. That is the gap between a story and a ledger, and it was about 1,000 times wide. At its peak, this company was valued at $9 billion. It had raised more than $700 million from some of the wealthiest families in America, and the entire structure rested on a single claim: that one drop of blood from a finger could run hundreds of medical tests. The claim was false. The device was called the Edison, a desktop analyzer that, in the pitch, could run a full blood panel from a few drops collected in a small tube. Theranos branded the nanotainer. No large needle, no venous draw. The promise was to make the American blood testing lab obsolete. Now the mechanism, and the first thing to understand is what this autopsy is not. There is no short interest here, no margin call, no crash on a trading screen. Theranos was never a public company. Its stock never traded on any exchange. That absence is not a detail. It is the mechanism. A public company is repriced every minute the market is open, by every buyer and seller who disagrees. A private company is repriced only when it chooses to sell more of itself, at a number the company itself controls. Theranos raised money 9 times across 9 years, and each time the price was set off its own narrative. There was no continuous market to say otherwise. Underneath that valuation was a machine that did not work as sold. According to the reporting that later broke the company, the Edison could reliably run only a small fraction of the tests on the menu. To cover the rest, Theranos secretly ran patient blood on modified, off-the-shelf commercial analyzers, principally Siemens machines, the exact conventional equipment the Edison was supposed to replace. And here the chemistry turns fatal. Those commercial machines are calibrated for a full venous tube of blood, not a few drops from a finger. To force a tiny finger prick sample to fit, Theranos diluted it, which pushed the concentrations it was measuring below the ranges the machines were validated to detect, amplifying error. Holmes publicly denied the dilution, even as internal data showed it. For a trader, look at what the product actually was: a commodity lab test, the same test you can buy from Quest or LabCorp, rewrapped as proprietary technology and marked up to a venture multiple. It was a synthetic, and the arbitrage only survives while nobody opens the box. Which brings us back to the single strongest number in this case: revenue of about $100,000 in 2014, sitting underneath a $9 billion valuation. That is a price-to-sales ratio in the tens of thousands. No continuous market on Earth would ever print that number. Only a market of one could. The next layer was distribution, and it was really collateral. In 2013, Walgreens went live with Theranos, committing on the order of $140 million, including a convertible loan of about $40 million. It opened more than 40 Theranos wellness centers, concentrated overwhelmingly in the Phoenix area of Arizona. The planned rollout to thousands of stores never happened. Safeway went further and got less. It spent roughly $350 million retrofitting around 800 stores with clinic space for in-store blood draws. Theranos missed deadline after deadline. A trial clinic at Safeway's own headquarters produced questionable results. By 2015, the deal was dead. $350 million written off, with 0 stores ever open to the public. Understand what those contracts did. They were not primarily revenue. They were credibility. Holmes converted corporate purchase orders into an implied clinical stamp of approval she never had, then recycled that stamp into the next fundraising round. a retail contract standing in for regulatory validation and for a working product. The board was the other form of collateral. George Shultz and Henry Kissinger, both former Secretaries of State, William Perry, a former Secretary of Defense, General James Mattis, former Senator Sam Nunn, a former Wells Fargo chief executive, statesmen, generals, and financiers, and not one working clinical chemist, pathologist, or diagnostics executive at the height. That is not oversight. That is a credit enhancement. Each famous name functioned like a guarantee stamped on the equity, and the investors underwrote the people vouching rather than the cash flows. The board was built to impress capital and government, not to audit an assay. Look at who wrote the checks because the selection tells the story. The Walton family of Walmart, around $150 million. Rupert Murdoch, more than $100 million. The DeVos family, about $100 million. The Cox family, about $100 million. Family fortunes and consumer brand money. Notably absent, the life sciences venture funds who could actually diligence a blood assay. They largely passed. That is the selection mechanism that let a $9 billion mark stand. The marginal buyer was structurally unqualified to price the risk. The specialists who could read the assay were not in the room. The people in the room were reading the board. At the center were two people. Elizabeth Holmes, who founded the company at 19 and controlled it through supermajority voting shares, and Ramesh Balwani, known as Sonny, President, Chief Operating Officer, and her romantic partner, a relationship concealed from the board. He ran the lab and enforced the culture of secrecy that kept the machine's failure invisible. A private fraud has no market to expose it, so exposure came from outside the capital structure. On October 15, 2015, Wall Street Journal reporter John Carreyrou published his investigation. Theranos was running the vast majority of its tests on conventional machines, not the Edison, and the results were unreliable. Theranos attacked the reporting aggressively. The reporting ran through insiders. Tyler Schultz, a young validation engineer and the grandson of board member George Shultz, reported the company to regulators and became a key source, at the cost of his relationship with his grandfather. Lab associate Erica Cheung helped trigger the federal inspection, and the reporter's most important source was Theranos' own former lab director, a pathologist who had watched the results fail from the inside. Then the state forced the mark. In early 2016, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the Newark, California lab and found it posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In July, it revoked the lab certificate and banned Holmes from owning or operating a lab for 2 years. Theranos voided or corrected tens of thousands of results in Arizona, roughly 1 in 10 of about 1.5 million tests. This was a forced liquidation in a market with no liquidity. The regulator pulled the operating license, the commercial partners walked, and the last-round investors were left holding equity with no exit and no working asset. Forbes cut its estimate of Holmes's paper net worth from about $4.5 billion to effectively zero. In September 2018, the company dissolved. The equity went to zero. The reckoning came in two forms. In March 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Holmes, Balwani, and Theranos with an elaborate, years-long fraud that raised more than $700 million. Holmes settled without admitting or denying wrongdoing. A $500,000 penalty, the return of nearly 19 million shares, surrender of her voting control, and a 10-year bar from leading a public company. Then the criminal case. On January 3, 2022, a federal jury convicted Holmes on 4 counts, 1 conspiracy and 3 counts of wire fraud. In November, she was sentenced to 135 months, 11 years and 3 months. Balwani, tried separately, was convicted on all 12 counts and sentenced to 155 months, longer than Holmes. Together, they were ordered to pay $452 million in restitution. And here is the tell in the verdict. Holmes was convicted of defrauding investors. She was acquitted on every count of defrauding patients. The jury found the lie provable against the people who could read a term sheet, and not proven beyond a reasonable doubt against the people who actually bled. This was, structurally, an investor fraud conviction. So read the structure one last time. The $9 billion was never wrong because the technology failed. It was wrong the day it was set because nothing ever traded against it. A valuation marked by its own seller is not a price. It is a narrative, defended with famous names and retail contracts posted in place of a real product. When an asset is priced by the person selling it, you are not looking at a market. You are looking at a claim, waiting for someone outside the cap table to test it. This is capital autopsy. This is not financial advice.